happy that we honor him by having Rhode Island's 1st District Congressman as our speaker this morning. David has made himself known on the national stage the last few weeks, and we thank him for appearing this morning with his busy schedule. We only wish we could have given him a bagel, lox, and cream cheese as sustenance. Please welcome Congressman David Cicilline.
Thank you, Barry. I too wish you'd give me a bagel and lox. Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you, and just wanted to make a few introductory comments, but save most of the time for Q&A. I first want to wish everyone good health and safety in the year ahead. Hope everyone is doing okay during this pandemic and taking care of yourselves and your families. It has been obviously a momentous couple of weeks for our country, actually a momentous 4 years in a lot of ways, but the good news is we now have a president, I think, who has demonstrated he will lead with empathy, who will put science and facts first, and who will work on behalf of all Americans. And I'm really looking forward to working with President Biden and his team, and Kamala Harris, our first woman, first Black woman, and first Indian American to serve as vice president. And it was a great honor to have the privilege of attending the inauguration of our new president and to watch this historic swearing in person. And I thought the president really delivered exactly the right message that really our country needed to hear in this moment. I think in many ways, the last 4 years have really tested us. But today, I think we can finally begin to turn the page and, as the president says, work to restore the soul of this country and our fraying bonds of national unity. And I am as committed as ever to working with the new administration, obviously to deliver results back here to Rhode Island, by ending this pandemic, building our economy back better, lowering the cost of healthcare, rooting out corruption, securing racial justice, ending gun violence, and taking the challenge of climate change on in a serious way. And I think we see in the first days of this administration, the president signed about 20 executive orders focused on a number of those issues already. He's really hit the ground running, and look forward to lots of productive work together. It was just 2 weeks ago that we witnessed an angry mob overtake the Capitol because of the lies that they had been fed for a long time by the former president. And it was important, I think, that President Biden pointed out that there is still such a thing as truth. And it was great to see that on day one, the president was signing executive orders to crush the coronavirus, including the use of the Defense Production Act, expanding testing, treatment, and launching a safe, effective vaccination campaign. He also put forth a proposal to deliver urgent economic relief by extending moratoriums on evictions, foreclosures, and student loan payments. He signed an executive order rejoining the historic Paris Climate Agreement and rolling back several Trump executive actions that he took to benefit special interests in big oil. And of course, honored the diversity of our great country by protecting dreamers and those with temporary protective status, rescinding the Muslim ban, and taking bold action to end LGBTQ discrimination, and also launching a whole of government initiative to promote racial equality. So I think there's a lot of work ahead, but I think our first priority with the new president is working to crush this deadly coronavirus, and the emergency help that the president announced, I think, is a very good and robust package. I'll just say quickly on the impeachment. When this event occurred, I was in my the Rayburn office building. First drafted a letter to Vice President Pence urging him to invoke the 25th Amendment. I then asked most of the members of the Judiciary Committee to join me in that letter, and we sent it out Wednesday evening. As events unfolded, and I really had the opportunity to watch the president's speech, former president's speech earlier in the day at the rally, and all the events that unfolded, it became clear to me that we needed to move forward with an article of impeachment to hold this president accountable. And I began drafting it Wednesday, late afternoon, was joined in that effort by my colleague, Congressman Ted Lieu from California, and Jamie Raskin from Maryland. And we drafted a single article of impeachment, incitement of insurrection, that really focused on the conduct leading up to this violent attack on our democracy. And this was a bloody coup. It was an attempt to substitute the will of these domestic terrorists with the will of the American people that had elected Joe Biden for president, and to stop the meeting of the Electoral College, which represents the peaceful transition of power from one administration to another. 5 people were killed, dozens were injured, 15 were hospitalized, serious damage was done to the Capitol. And I think it was very clear to everyone that you cannot allow a president to incite this kind of violence against our own government, against our democracy, and not be held accountable. And so we moved forward. We moved quickly with the most bipartisan impeachment in American history, and that passed the House. We will deliver the article of impeachment to the Senate tomorrow, and then begin a trial in early February. I think it'll be February 8th, according to the best sort of sense of what the Senate is going to do. And then we'll have the responsibility of presenting the case of the president's conduct to the United States Senate. So I'll stop there and say, you know, we're excited to have control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, because we have passed hundreds of bills that have sat on Mitch McConnell's desk for the last 2 years. And to be able to know now that we'll have a real opportunity to have those bills considered in the Senate because the Democrats are in control is good news for Rhode Island, I think good news for our country. So I'll stop there so we can get to your questions.
Okay, so I'm going to be reading the questions, David. Some of them are addressed in some format, but Jacob just texted and said just read the questions. So we'll start with a quietly different viewpoint question that came in. How is an impeachment substantially without debate consistent with due process of law and ability to mount defenses, including reports that the awful invasion of the Capitol was planned well in advance of Trump's speech that day? And also, how is an impeachment of a president who has already left office consistent with Joe Biden's inaugural call for unity?
So a couple of things. First and foremost, I think we all as a country are unified in our strong opposition to domestic terrorism and to any attack on our democracy. I think people are united in that way. And in terms of the healing of our country, I think most people would agree that you can't really have healing until you have accountability, truth, and justice. And history is filled with examples that prove that point, that you just can't sort of hope can overlook this and just move on, that there needs to be accountability and there needs to be truth and there needs to be justice before you can move to that next phase of healing. So I think this is really important. It cannot be the case that a president in the final days of his or her term know that they sort of get a constitutional freebie. You know, as long as you can engage in really grave misconduct, including inciting an attack on your own government in an effort to stay in power. But as long as you do it late enough in your term, you'll be, relieved of being held accountable. That would be a terrible message and a dangerous precedent. And in fact, to the second part of the question, it has always been the case that former officials can be impeached and tried and convicted. That has been the practice and the rule in the Senate since the very early Congresses. There are lots of examples of it. And so the suggestion that because he's not in office, he can't be tried would be a departure from hundreds of years of precedent, and I think very dangerous, and an invitation to future misconduct from presidents. And so I think this is really important to do it. And with respect to the due process question, the first impeachment was a secret plot, to get Ukraine to corrupt the election. And so there required a lot of digging and hearings and that kind of thing. This impeachment is quite different because it happened in public view. It happened, people saw it, millions of Americans watched it on television, and it really doesn't require the kind of hearings that you would normally, investigation to collect evidence. It was all kind of done in open. Because of the urgency and the danger that he presented, we had to move expeditiously. And this notion about due process, it's important to remember that the House proceedings are the charging process, akin to a grand jury. That's the accusatory document. And the trial is where due process rights attach. And so the ability to present evidence, to examine witnesses, to do all the things that you're entitled to do at trial will happen, in fact, at the trial in the Senate. That's where the due process attaches. So this notion that somehow the president was denied due process is just not true. And he'll have an opportunity at a trial to the extent the Senate determines how those proceedings will happen to present his case, present his defense, make his arguments. So that's, I think I covered all the questions in that one. Judy, I think you're on. Yeah.
So the next question is, what was your personal account during the insurrection, and how did, were you there, and how close to danger was it, et cetera?
So I was lucky. I was in my office in the Rayburn office building because we were following COVID protocols and only on the floor when it was our turn to speak. And so we were discouraged from being there to watch the early part of the debate. And then shortly after 1, 2 o'clock is when we were advised by the Sergeant at Arms to shelter in place, to lock our office doors, to close the shades, to not use electronics, keep our voices down because we were uncertain as to whether or not the office buildings would be breached. So I was safe and in my office. You know, we had to stay there all day for the most part until votes. But many of my colleagues who were in the chamber suffered significant trauma from this event, and many are still struggling with PTSD. I mean, they heard gunshots and windows breaking and, you know, got evacuated. Many of them called their family members to say goodbye, fearful they might not see their spouses or children again. I mean, it was a really traumatic, really terrifying experience for a lot of my colleagues.
This kind of falls as a follow-up question to how frustrating is it when what appears obvious of the president inciting the Capitol insurrection and Republicans want to deny reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's frustrating. I think, you know, one other part of your first question, which I didn't address, was this notion of, well, this was a planned event before the president's speech. It's really important to understand that the incitement to insurrection really began when the president promoted the big lie, when he said, I didn't lose the election. I actually won the election by tens of millions of votes, and the corrupt Democrats stole the election from me. And then he engaged in a campaign to convince his supporters of that big lie. And he promoted it and promoted it. And then he tried to bully the vice president to violate the Constitution and just declare him the winner. He tried to bully election officials to change the election results. He filed, 60 frivolous lawsuits. He continued to promote this big lie to enrage his supporters so that they would take action. And it culminated on January 6th, where he, in that final rally, said, you need to fight like hell, you need to show strength. If you don't go there and march and fight, you're not gonna have a country anymore. And that was the incitement to violence. But it was a product of a long effort that didn't only involve that one speech, but an effort to persuade his supporters of this lie that he actually won, when of course he didn't. And so it's frustrating in the face of that kind of evidence and that kind of violence that not only did many of the Republicans enable that because they chimed in and they joined lawsuits and they made speeches that promoted the big lie, but even after the violent, bloody attack where these domestic terrorists came to hang Mike Pence, assassinate Speaker Pelosi, hunt down members of Congress, that resulted in the death of 5 people, 50 people injured, 15 people hospitalized, tremendous damage to the Capitol. They still came back and voted to object to the counting of some of these votes from states that had certified their election results. So they still participate. And that to me is really frustrating. And they ultimately are going to have to be accountable to their voters for that. But it's frustrating, but we still have a responsibility to present our evidence and to do everything possible to hold this president accountable.
One more follow-up question, and then we'll move on to other subjects. With the revelation from Washington Post over the weekend of further former President Trump intervention plans, would the House proceed to a second impeachment clause or just more justification?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of this evidence shows the context of the conduct of the president, of just how desperate he was to hold on to power, that he was prepared to do anything he could, legal or illegal, to stay in power and subvert the election results. And, there's so much evidence about just how desperate he was to do that. And this is just more of it.
Okay, moving on. Since it is important to get our current citizens working again, how does the new administration plan to handle new immigration so as not to disenfranchise our lower and middle working class citizens by taking jobs away from them and giving them to new immigrants?
Yeah, so there's a lot of mythology around the idea that immigrants take jobs. There's just no evidence to support that. And in fact, many of the jobs that new arrivals to America take are jobs that just can't be filled because Americans don't want those particular jobs. So I think there's an enormous amount of data that shows immigration is good for our economy. It contributes to our GDP. It contributes to economic growth. We renew our democracy, frankly, by each generation of new immigrants that come to America that have made us a stronger, more exciting, more dynamic country. And I think the president has put forth a good immigration proposal in the early days of his new administration. And we've got to fix our broken immigration system. We have to particularly fix our, restore our refugee program, which was really the crown jewel of our immigration system that the former administration just decimated, and America no longer became a place that invited people from all over the world to come here to call it home. There's so much evidence about the role that new immigrants have played in terms of, creating new companies, creating new jobs. I forget the number, but some huge percentage of the CEOs of some of the most successful companies in America are immigrants. So there's just so much evidence that immigrants and new arrivals to our country are a positive force and contribute significantly to our country. And I think President Biden's immigration policy reflects that understanding.
So let's move on to why we're having our own bagels at home this morning. Coronavirus and the plan, the rollout, and particularly Rhode Island, the rollout and the additional capacity. But there's been stories about hospitals offering them to board members and staff and not going by the protocol. And how are we going to get this back on the road and get more? How do you feel about the plan being rolled out and what's going to happen? And are we going to get, how quickly we'll get these vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very big issue. And I think even the Biden administration was shocked at how little preparation had been done in terms of developing a national system for vaccine distribution. This is a major undertaking, but something America is capable of doing. And I think President Biden has assembled a really high quality team that's putting together this plan. Part of it is, increasing production. And so invoking the Defense Production Act to really accelerate the manufacturing of vaccine, being certain that we are safely bringing more vaccines that are under review into the market, and then making sure that it's being distributed, in full partnership with states. I mean, I think every state has a responsibility to distribute them pursuant to a plan they develop. And I think, Rhode Island is trying to identify people who are at the highest risk: healthcare workers, first responders, nursing home residents, and then going to people who are over 75 or over 65 with underlying health conditions. But, there's a lot of anxiety because people want this vaccine and they want it quickly. Part of it is a supply problem, part of it is a distribution problem. But I think the absence of a plan has been the biggest problem. And now we have a competent administration with a competent president who's focused on this singularly. I mean, sadly, former President Trump spent the last several months of his administration not focused on this at all, not doing anything related to the coronavirus, and focusing on his effort to undermine the election results. And, this requires your attention to actually get the job done. I think we're going to see a very different approach, and we already are, from the new president. But this is obviously an important priority for our whole delegation, getting more vaccines into Rhode Island, making sure they're distributed fairly.
So I know that daily briefs are again in place, but what is the position on big tech, social media, free speech versus censor path forward for addressing hate speech now that the Democrats have House control and we have a new administration in place?
So, I mean, when you talk about the platforms and free speech, it's sort of I think, an argument that you have to resist, because free speech relates to the government interfering with your ability to speak. These are private companies. So the First Amendment is sort of not directly applicable. Having said that, they obviously have so much reach and are so big that their willingness to limit the use of the platforms has implications that we should understand. I completed a 16-month investigation of the large technology platforms as the chair of the House Judiciary Antitrust Subcommittee. This was the most bipartisan antitrust investigation probably ever done in Congress, and the first antitrust investigation done in 50 years. So this was a massive undertaking. It took 16 months to complete. We developed a 500-page report that makes a whole series of recommendations to bring competition back into the digital marketplace and to really to really attack the monopoly power of these large technology platforms. This is a real issue with respect to the promotion of hate speech. As you all know, if a newspaper or a television broadcasts something which is untrue, or they can be sued under our libel or slander laws. Because of Section 230, an exemption that Congress gave the social media platforms, they are free from liability. So they basically have no liability, whatever is published on their platforms. They have proven, I think, very clearly that they can't regulate themselves. And part of the reason they can't regulate themselves is because their business model incentivizes the distribution of the most provocative, most outrageous information, because the more provocative, more untrue, sort of more crazy it is, the more likes they get, the more it's shared, and the more money they make. So they have a business model that incentivizes them to basically share the most horrible stuff. And that's a problem. And so we have a responsibility to reform Section 230, I think, to bring more competition to the digital marketplace. And this broad dissemination of false information has created violence. It's helped to create genocide. It's significantly undermined our democracy if you look at what happened in the prior presidential election. So this is a serious issue. I think in many ways one of the most serious issues we face. I'm excited to have a new president who believes in reforms that are necessary in this space, and is, I think, going to be a great partner as we move forward in this Congress to implement many of the reforms that we developed in my investigation that I think will really improve the behavior of these large technology platforms.
Okay, I'm going to go to our chat room. Some questions have popped up that may be some follow-up questions too. Can you expand on the Congress investigation into how the mob got onto the Capitol grounds and worse, into the building?
I can only say that there are several investigations underway, and there will be a number of congressional committees that will hold hearings to do some of this in public view. I think everyone was stunned at the ease at which these domestic terrorists were able to breach the Capitol and get into the building. And there has obviously been some reporting about whether there were some law enforcement officials that were sympathetic to the cause, and some video that would at least suggest that. The President Biden made the point before he was sworn in a press conference that we can only imagine what the response would have been had that crowd of domestic terrorists been Black or brown folks. We would have probably seen a very different result, and I think that's a fair question. And so there obviously has been, there's a full security view underway, but also a review of kind of how this happened and how were the Capitol Police so unprepared, and what efforts were made to get additional assistance, since much of the kind of information about what was going to happen that day was on websites and publicly reported, and there was a significant amount of information available ahead of that day that should have prevented that.
Okay, another follow-up question. If not convicted in the Senate with a 2/3 vote, are there other sanctions that can be imposed based on a majority?
There aren't. I mean, impeachment is really the only sanction. I mean, the conviction is really the only sanction of the executive that's in the Constitution. The only thing that doesn't require a majority is if the Senate voted to convict, they have to vote by a 2/3 vote. If they then want to bar President Trump from holding federal office ever again, that is by a simple majority. But that can only happen after a conviction, which is by a 2/3 vote. There may be other prosecution of anyone involved in this from the president on down, by law enforcement, criminal charges, but that's a separate proceeding. That wouldn't happen, obviously, in the Senate.
Okay, and one last question. I just got a little note from Jacob that, and then maybe a couple
God, he's really a
more.
pest.
I know, he's texting me constantly. Okay, let's see. Let me pick one here. It appears that the 2020 census will result in Rhode Island losing one of its congressional seats. Do you plan to run for re-election in 2022?
Well, I hope we don't. We'll know, I guess, in about a month. I think they're a little delayed in terms of the final calculation. I think all of us hope we don't lose a seat because, we have over 1 million people in Rhode Island. That would be a big congressional district. And obviously, it's important to Rhode Island because so much of the way that federal funds are returned back to states relate to how many congressional districts you have. So federal money that comes to Rhode Island to help seniors stay in particular housing, to support education, to help rebuild the infrastructure of Rhode Island, to deal with the healthcare issues in our state. All these things are impacted by the loss of a congressional district, and it will result in the loss of millions, tens of millions of dollars to our state. So I hope we don't. I think we did a really good job in terms of the census. So hopefully some other states didn't do as good a job and will end up holding on to 2 seats. But I hope to have the opportunity to continue to serve Rhode Island. And I hope that I continue to have a colleague in the House from Rhode Island too, because it matters to our state that we continue to have 2 folks. And it would be kind of just psychologically a kind of stomach punch if we went down to 1 member of Congress. So hopefully we won't.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. And Brotherhood appreciates you giving your time to this breakfast. I will tell you that our next Brotherhood breakfast is the Herbert Wagner Memorial Breakfast in April. So watch the shofar for details of our speaker. Elliot, do you have anything else to say?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Wanted to thank the Congressman. Thank everyone for joining. Excellent job, Judy. All the best, Congressman.
Thanks, everyone, and stay safe.